The chat if you need the captioning link for today. All right, welcome everybody. This is the Chloe 9 webinar, Strategy Shift, Institutions Respond to Sustained Online Demand. Thank you all so much for coming today. And before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping and a lot of thanks. Next slide, please, Barbara. Okay, so this is in a webinar format, so your cameras are not on and you are muted, but you do have the ability to type in the chat. And I also encourage you, as we go along, please do put any questions in the Q&A. So we may run out of time at the end, depending on how quickly we go through some things. So please do ask your questions in the Q&A, and all of the report authors are going to be attending to those and answering those as we go along. So please make use of that. And we would also like to thank, next slide. All right, big thank you to our sponsors. Our platinum sponsors, iDesign. Thank you so much, iDesign. You have been a big, strong Chloe supporter since the beginning. We appreciate your support. New this year, thank you so much, Science Interactive, new platinum sponsor. And I'm actually going to be doing a webinar with them soon. Our gold sponsor, longtime Chloe supporter, Archer Education. Thank you so much. And of course, our affiliate sponsor, the Online Learning Consortium. Thank you so much, OLC. And we would also like to thank our Chloe advisory panel. You can see here the list of folks that were the Chloe advisory panel or CAP members from Chloe 6 through 8. And then joining us for Chloe 9 all the way through to Chloe 11. You can see there on the right-hand side. So we have representatives from our affiliate sponsor, OLC, Dylan Barth, and Tom Kavanaugh, Elizabeth Chibauchi, Christy Ford, Angela Gudner, Connie Johnson, Val Kelly, Tina Parscale, Julie Porosky-Hamlin, Karen Reggae, Jeff Seaman, Morris Thomas, and Lori Williams. Thank you all so much for giving us all your feedback and, of course, all your perspectives as chief online officers yourself in many cases. Next slide. Also, and most importantly, probably, thank you to all of you that filled out the Chloe report. So if you're joining us today and you are Chief Online Learning Officer, go ahead and let us know in the chat. Special thank you to you. Without you, we could not do the Chloe report, just like we could not do it without our sponsors. The other thing I wanted to mention this year is for colos that fill out the report, they're always given the little incentive, little thank you gift, and they have the option of like a gift card, or they could donate they're a small incentive to QM Gives Back. So this year, our Chief Online Learning Officers, they have raised $2,135, and that will be donated to an in-need school district. Last year, that was the Valley View Elementary School in Bloomington, Minnesota, and this goes through Scholastic Books. So you all helped to purchase books for schools that are deeply in need of that reading material. So Colos, thank you for your time. Thank you for filling it out. And thank you for your generosity. Truly, truly appreciate it. All right, next slide, please. And of course, our presenters today, and they can introduce themselves when they turn up to speak for their sections, but I'm joined here by my Chloe Project co-director, Richard Garrett. He's the Eduventures Chief Research Officer at Encoura. Also, Eric Fredericksen, he is the Associate Vice President and Professor at the University of Rochester. He is also our in-house Chief Online Learning Officer. And Janae Robert, she is the Senior Researcher at EDUCAUSE. EDUCAUSE is a new partner organization joining us this year, so big welcome to EDUCAUSE, and thank you so much, Janae, and all of your team that contributed to the report. Next slide, please. So for our agenda today, I'm going to very quickly talk a little bit about our respondent information, and then we have 4 sections in the Chloe report, and we're going to highlight just some graphs and data points for each: online strategies and priorities, online revenue and financing, outsourcing, and also new this year, AI, attitudes, uses, and policies. Okay. So first, respondent information, and I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly. So representation looks pretty similar to past Chloe samples at the institutional level, and this is, historically true as well. Chloe 9 sample overcounts our public four-year institutions a bit. undercounts for-profits. We typically do not get a lot of responses from for-profit institutions. When you look at the total or online enrollment rates, however, public four-year schools and the for-profits look a little bit underrepresented in the Chloe 9 sample. So very similar to past Chloe samples, still very representative of higher education in the US. For those of you that do want to read a little bit more about the sample, you can do so in the report. It starts on page 44. You want to do a deep dive there. All right, so let's get into our first section here. Online strategies and priorities. So this is, in terms of online strategy, this is something that we've been diving into a little bit more deeply on the past few Chloes. Last year, we asked whether or not that online strategy was really matching demand. This year, we had a slightly different version of the question, and we asked our chief online officers, does your institutional strategic approach align with your online learning goals? Right. So looking at, excluding our fully online institutions and those that said we're committed to being a campus-based institution, you can see there that a near majority there really have incorporated institutional online learning into their strategy in some way. So 32% said, we have a mix of on-campus and online students, but we have fully incorporated online learning into our institutional strategic plan. 24% said we have incorporated it, but that embedded strategy really only targets or emphasizes specific student groups. And in the subsequent slides, you're going to see how that plays out in terms of institutional strategic approach. So about half of our sample said we have incorporated it into our goals, but really in those two distinct ways, either throughout the institution or targeting those specific groups. Let's go back to the first slide. And then if you look below that, if we get back to that slide, okay, I think I remember it though. So you have about a quarter of the institutions that said, we're still discussing it. We do have goals for online learning, but we have not yet incorporated it into our strategy. And that last line there on the bottom, they said they don't have clear goals yet, but it's something that they are discussing. So really the sample was kind of split in half with those that have more targeted goals. They have incorporated it into the strategy. And then those institutions that may not yet have goals or really are discussing how those goals might really play out into their strategy. Next slide. So when we break this down and we look at it by sector, here's where you can really see how the different strategy plays out, especially for different institutional types. And we're just having some technical difficulty. It's fine. All right. So when we break it down by sector, I think I could remember it as well. So there are public two-year institutions really are the institutions that have more fully incorporated it throughout the entire institution because they're trying better to serve all of their students. Whereas you can see private 4 years, for example, 38% said that embedded strategy really only emphasizes specific student groups, right? So the student group that mainly comes to mind are those graduate students. So you see our 4-year institutions, they're much more represented in that strategy that really emphasizes student groups, whereas your public 2 years, community college, fully incorporating online throughout their institution. Otherwise, very equal across sectors in terms of those that maybe are still formulating those goals or still examining how those goals are going to fit into their strategy. Next slide. We also asked our chief online learning officers, what are some of your priorities? And we gave them a list that you can see there on the left, different priorities that we know are out there for higher ed institutions when it comes to online. And they could choose as many of these as they wanted. You can see, though, that a very high majority, almost 70%, said creating online versions of on-campus courses was a big priority for them. Very close second there, 65% creating online versions of those on-campus degrees. So we're seeing a lot of echoes from Chloe 8 in that, still focusing on online versions of courses and programs. A little bit less than half said, we're also thinking about those online non-degrees with no on-campus equivalent, and then also online full degrees with no on-campus equivalent. Next slide, please. We also asked them, though, what is your top priority? And we said you can pick two in terms of your top priority. And here you see a little bit of difference in the data. So overall, 43% said online versions of those on-campus degrees, a little bit higher of a priority when they had to rank it for those on-campus courses. But close second, 39% said, again, creating those online versions of on-campus courses. And again, you see that strategy play out that we were talking about in that first slide, with either throughout the institution with that focus on courses, or really focusing on specific student groups. And there you see a deeper focus on those online programs. So you can see here, for example, private 4 years, they're pretty evenly mixed. Public 4 years, though, 50% of them really concentrating on those degrees, more so than those on-campus courses. And then that is reversed a little bit with those public 2-year community colleges. Next slide, please. We also asked them, this is a much more competitive marketplace, especially with a lot more online degree programs, a lot more choice for students who want that flexibility of online. So, how are you differentiating yourself in this competitive marketplace? Or what are some student graphics or groups maybe that you are targeting more than others? No surprise there, 63% said recruiting students within our geographical area. That's very common, even if you are recruiting for online. 60%, though, rethinking and trying to maybe target in a new way, recruiting non-traditional learners. About half of our sample said, we're really focusing on offering a wide variety of modality options. So they're attempting to really tap into that need for flexibility and choice that we're hearing from students. We also highlighted some specific data points here in yellow about quality. So last year in Chloe 8 and a little bit in Chloe 7 as well, we asked our institutions, especially in terms of marketing, are you marketing the quality of your online education, the quality of your support for online learners? And we are seeing an uptick in institutions saying we are talking about this publicly. It is used in our marketing. So 45% of our sample said we are promoting the overall quality of our online education in our marketing. 35%, though, said promoting online quality for specific degree programs. So that was in Chloe 8. We did a little bit of a deeper dive in that. Again, we see that this is potentially a missed opportunity for institutions, especially when you are in a more competitive marketplace when it comes to online degree programs. Slight disappointment this year to see 32% really only focusing on promoting that support for online learners. So, in terms of takeaways, and, when you ask yourself, what can I do with the Chloe report aside from maybe benchmarking? Here's where maybe you can see as an institution some opportunities to better talk about your online learning, your online programs, ways that you are supporting online students, especially in your marketing. Next slide, please. We also asked this year about barriers and challenges to really moving some of those online initiatives forward. And you can see there that we asked our colos, is this something that you feel is fully resolved? Something that you are working to resolve? An issue that you feel is just unresolvable? Or something that maybe you expect in the future to come up as an issue, or not an issue at all? So the good news here is that the majority really feel as though they have resolved or are actively and successfully working to resolve some of these tensions and issues. So I really wanted to focus our attention on those things that our colos said, maybe these are unresolvable. We are still wrestling with them. Looking at the bottom there, 12% budgetary issues specific to online. That's not a surprise. Eric is going to be talking a little bit about online budgets, and he can do a deeper dive into that. You can also see, looking there at the top, lack of faculty administrative buy-in, so you may not be getting that support for online initiatives. Lack of online learning support staff, 12% said this is an unresolvable issue, and that may play into that budget problem as well. You may not have the staff that you feel that you need to appropriately scale online learning. But the top standout point there was 14% of our colo respondents said faculty autonomy is an unresolvable issue. Next slide, please. So when we asked them what the primary barrier to online initiatives is, faculty autonomy also came out on top. 20% of our responding colos said faculty autonomy is an issue. Slight second place there, tensions around institutional mission and culture. And, one takeaway here is to really have good collaborative, maybe even better campus conversations around online, around supporting faculty, and again, around that strategic mission and focus in today's higher education landscape. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who's going to talk about online revenue, funding, and pricing.
Great, thanks, Bethany. And good to see all of our friends, lots of my friends and peers across the country in the participant list. I'm really happy to be with you. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the financial areas that we investigated in CLOE 9. So as you can see in the first chart here, we wanted to get a sense of, from a budgetary perspective, how institutions are treating their online activities. You can see here in blue, more than half of the respondents indicated that they considered it a net generator, revenue generator for distribution within the institution. In the orangish color there, a quarter of the colos reported that there was wide variation by program, and another 15% in red said, we view it as a net cost that, it's just something that we incur to support the institution's mission. Now, Bethany mentioned that we also have additional data that we use to sort of investigate some of these questions further. And so we break these down. And in this case, we broke this one down by institutional sector. We saw some differences here. Public four-year schools were a little more likely to treat online programs as a net revenue generator than their private, not-for-profit four-year schools and the public two-year schools. The public two-year schools, they were twice as likely to view online programs as a net cost to support the institution's mission as compared to the public and private four-year counterparts. When we broke this one down based on online enrollment, what we saw here was that the institutions with higher online enrollment tended to treat online programs as a net revenue generator, and the institutions with lower online enrollments tended to manage online programs as a net cost to support the institution's mission. So as I looked at that one, I tend to maybe believe that this might suggest almost an evolutionary strategy by institutions. Perhaps they initially view this as they get started with online. They initially view it as a cost or an activity to invest in. And then as they progress and become more successful and do more, then they later on see this as a means to generate revenue. So maybe that's one possibility here. Let's go to the next slide. We also asked about resources for next year. So we asked, it's a budget, we asked a basic budget question. The most cited response, you can see there in red, 41% of colos reported that their budgets remained flat with no additional resources. However, note the bars above the red one here. 30% noted that they're going to see some increase in resources. So we counted bounded that by saying that's less than 10%. But we also had 12% of colos report a substantial increase, and we defined that as 10% or more in terms of an increase. We had much smaller numbers of colos indicating reductions with, as you can see here, with 9% and 7%. So I look at this and I might try to paint a generally positive picture of the allocation of resources for online learning efforts this year. Once again, we also investigated this question by institutional sector and by enrollment size. And what we saw there was we basically saw some consistent responses in general with flat budgets as the top answer across the board. Although the private 4 years were a little more likely to report a decrease in resources as compared to the public 4-year and public 2-year schools. All right, let's go on to the next question. Because I think the next one is also pretty interesting. And when I talk about this, I give my friend Richard a lot of credit for helping us think through this. That it wasn't going to be, it was going to be more interesting to take a look at budgets when we not only try to get a sense of where they are, but asked an additional complementary question about whether they were adequate or sufficient. So we did. We complemented this question with another one about the perception of the adequacy of resources. And we asked colos to rate their agreement with this statement. We have sufficient institutional resources available for online learning at our institution. And what did we see in terms of responses? They were somewhat evenly distributed. We had 39% either strongly agreeing or agreeing. We had 42% strongly disagreeing or just disagreeing. And then we had, as you can see here, we had 19% neutral. The thing that's interesting here is the previous question noted that 16% of respondents said that they were expecting a budget decrease. But this question reveals that 42% of respondents indicated that their budget wasn't adequate. And so there must be colos with flat, maybe even increasing budgets that still don't believe that the resources for online learning are sufficient for the needs of their institution. We did discover some differences by institutional sector for this question. The private four-year schools were more likely to disagree that resources were sufficient as compared to the public two-year and public four-year schools. Low online enrollment schools and mid-online enrollment schools were more likely to disagree that they had sufficient resources as compared to the high online enrollment schools. So as we reflect on this question, again, I think it's a factor that we have to consider might be the expectations of the institution, right? So a colo with a modest budget increase, but substantially higher hopes and expectations for growth, they're naturally going to be concerned about the adequacy of these resources. So again, I'm glad we looked at both of these questions together. You might think that a shrinking budget would be less adequate and a growing one would at least be adequate. But again, I did further analysis on this, crosstabs, chi-square analysis. It just wasn't the case. We definitely had colos reporting a substantial increase in budget and strongly disagreeing that the budget was adequate. Okay, enough on that. Let's go into tuition policy. Next slide. In CLOE 9, we revisited tuition policy and whether colleges and universities charge more, the same, or less for online programs as compared to on-campus programs. In response to this question, you can see here the vast majority, so the 50 plus the 20 here, so 70% indicated the institution published a standard tuition rate and it was largely the same as on campus or with variations by program, but generally the same as on campus. About the same percentage reported either greater at 13% or lesser with 15%. With comparing online with on campus. This finding, it's really pretty consistent with what we saw in CLOE 4 in 2020 and also with CLOE 6 in 2021. My view of this is, once again, this data counters public perceptions of, oh, there's a lot of significant discounting for online courses. And I think it counters it because we also have some institutions that charge a premium. As we noted in CLOE 6, this modality-independent approach to tuition policy, I think it also reflects higher education practices in general. So here at our university, we charge the same tuition for large lecture courses that are on campus as we do for small seminar courses that are on campus. I think I might even argue that this consistent approach to tuition might even help institutions avoid perceptions about lower quality that might be associated with price. All right, let's go on to my last slide in terms of online tuition policies. So to go on with this further exploration of financial topics, we asked about, do institutions do tuition discounting for online programs? As you can see here, right in at the top in blue, most cited response was that they do not discount tuition for online programs. This was followed by 26% of colos saying that their discounting strategy for online programs is the same as on campus, and another quarter saying it varies by academic unit and program. We did see smaller discounts for online programs. That was reported and noted by 4%, and only 2% talked about larger discounts for online programs. We did examine this by institutional sector, and in this question area, we found that two-year public schools were much more likely to indicate that they do not discount tuition for online programs as compared to the public four-year and private four-year schools. Of note is the most cited response for the private four-year schools is that their approach to tuition discounting varied by academic unit and program. As I looked at this one relative to online enrollment size, it was really consistent. All three levels, low, mid, and high, all indicated that they don't discount tuition for online programs as their number one answer to this question. Okay, I know that was fast, but I hope that gives you at least a little bit of a flavor of what we saw in the financial areas. And I am going to turn this back to Bethany.
Yeah, in fact, to me, I think, Eric. That's okay. So,
sorry, Richard.
It's okay, no problem. So, hi, everyone. I am going to talk about outsourcing, but through two particular lenses. So the acronyms on this slide, TPS and OPM. So TPS refers to third-party services, so meaning non-institutional, non-accredited entities that partner with colleges and universities to offer various services, develop and deliver online programs. And we're focused on that topic because last year, the federal government, the US Department for Education, unexpectedly in a Dear Colleague letter announced that they were contemplating a much more expansive definition of third-party servicer and anticipating a lot more involved oversight of those relationships and a lot of controversy, even a lawsuit. The department took note, pushed back, delayed, thought about it again. And we thought it was perhaps not going to happen, but just recently they've announced that they are going to engage in a formal negotiated rulemaking around this issue this fall. So we'll see what happens. So that's the first topic, but it essentially relates to this question of growing regulator interest in how online programs are organized and a recognition that many of them rely on a variety of third parties, non-accredited entities, and a sense of just wanting to know more about that. And that relates to the other acronym, OPM, Online Program Management. This is a particular kind of third-party servicer that classically offers a suite of services to colleges and universities to help develop and deliver online programs, sometimes through a revenue share arrangement or sometimes through fee for service. So these are both key aspects of online higher education. And because of growing regulatory interest in both of them, we wanted to get COLO's reaction, at least as of the beginning of this year, as to how concerned they were about either of these developments and the extent to which they worked with OPMs in particular. So let's go to the first slide. So starting with the third-party servicer issue, remember this context of possible expanded federal oversight of third-party servicer arrangements. So we asked COLOs, how concerned are you about this possibility? Knowing that some COLOs have extensive partnerships, some may have no partnerships, plus the ambiguity as to what counts as a relevant partnership. Who is a third-party servicer with some connection to federal student aid, because that's the real interest of the department here, versus some kind of other contract that really isn't of interest to the department. So as of early 2024, we found the majority of COLOs had some concern about this matter, but only 7% were greatly worried about the burden of compliance or possibly uncovering arrangements that the department might take exception to. 23%, they were moderately concerned, still a lot up in the air. The details are unclear, still unclear. And then even higher proportions said small concern. So the majority, some concern, but most not greatly concerned. 20% said no concern. So that may imply we have no partnerships that we think are relevant, and that may be true, or it may reflect some ambiguity. And certainly the department still seems very interested in a much more expanded notion of what counts as a third-party servicer, who is defined as touching federal student aid beyond the obvious. 12% said unsure, unclear, I think, given the ambiguity. And then again, 10% said doesn't apply, which may or may not be accurate. Let's go to the next slide. So we then said, well, in the meantime, knowing that the department is interested in this issue may not go away, are you doing anything about it? 42% said, we're not doing anything new. We're just continuing with routine review and planning who we're partnering with, the nature of that partnership, making sure everything is clear and transparent. 28% said, we're really not sure what, if anything, differently we should do because everything is too ambiguous. And similarly, 18% said we're discussing, but we haven't come to a decision yet. Only 6% said we are engaging in special contract review and compliance training above and beyond routine arrangements. So I would say this stance captured in the early months of 2024 is probably where we are now, but what we now that we didn't then is that the department is embarking on negotiated rulemaking. It may run into the election, depending on how the election goes. This could all be off the table, or it could very much be back on the table. But I think it's a reminder that because online learning in particular is associated with various kinds of third party that in some way or another are getting federal student aid dollars, that this Department for Education and possibly the next Department for Education will continue to ask questions. And we know that one accreditor, Middle States, has already gone ahead and expanded their own reporting requirements and definition around third-party services. So it's not just a federal government issue, it's increasingly an accreditation issue as well. So I think this is definitely one to keep a watching brief on. Let's go to the next slide. And just to finish this topic, we also asked colos in terms of contract renewal, possibly future contracts, new partners, has this atmosphere of increased third-party oversight changed your calculations? A majority said no. We're going to continue to partner or not partner based on the facts on the ground and the merits of the partnership rather than worrying about any particular regulatory scrutiny. Again, 20% unclear, but 19% said we think it's somewhat complicated the environment. Maybe we'll make a different decision about contract renewal or new contracts. And 3%, but only 3%, said it's greatly complicated the environment for new and existing contracts. So let's go to the next slide, which is OPMs specifically. And OPMs are a much more prominent kind of third-party servicer and are also in the lines of greater interest from the department, insofar as, if you remember, back in 2011, OPMs got a last-minute reprieve from efforts to tighten up the incentive compensation rules. So by that, I mean the ban on recruiters at colleges and universities being rewarded on a per enrollment basis for domestic students. But OPMs lobbied and got a carve-out that said, so long as OPMs are offering a suite of services to colleges and universities, so not just student recruitment, but also some technology, some instructional design, other services, as long as that suite is in place, a revenue share arrangement where essentially the OPM gets paid based on the number of enrollments is okay as far as federal incentive compensation rules go. But we know that the current U.S. Department for Education is increasingly uncomfortable with that carve-out and worries that this inflates pricing or it may encourage enrollment that's not really in the student's best interest. And there's concern among OPMs and some of their partners that have rev share arrangements that the department might decide, and it's free to do so without going through Congress or going through negotiated rulemaking. This was a administrative decision back in 2011 rather than anything else, that they might decide to do away with that carve out for revenue share arrangements. And some OPMs and some OPM partnerships might struggle to move to some sort of more conventional fee for service arrangement. So we wanted to get an update in Chloe 9 as to how, one, who was working with an OPM, who wasn't, who used to, who might again, who will never again, and then their attitudes to some of these issues. So this slide shows you the breakdown early 2024 across the Chloe sample as to who is currently working with an OPM. So from left to right, 15% work with just one OPM, and 9% say they work with more than one OPM. And that combination of 24% is a little bit higher than we saw in previous Chloe surveys. So despite all the anxiety about the OPM industry and possible regulatory changes, in our sample at least, we seem to be seeing a steady increase in the proportion of schools that work with an OPM. Our sample obviously is a little skewed towards online active institutions. So I would discount that ratio a little bit if we're thinking about US higher education as a whole, but it shows the enduring appeal and value of OPMs for many institutions looking for investment, expertise, support, and so on. Now, in the middle, we have 52% say they've never worked with an OPM and have no plans to. That's the most common scenario. But 7% say we've never worked with an OPM, but we're thinking about it. So still this enduring interest in OPMs, even though the online market is more crowded, more mature, it's harder even for the OPMs to give their partners that special lift. And then on the right-hand side, we have former OPM clients. So 17% said we used to work with an OPM, but we no longer do. A small proportion of that group say we're actually thinking of working with an OPM again. But the remainder say, no, we've moved on. It was helpful. It was a catalyst, but we've learned those lessons and we're now independent. So overall, the majority do not work with an OPM, but most that do still seems to be increasing, and still interest from those that don't or used to. Next slide. So we then said, well, given all the uncertainty about regulation and the market, we know 2U's file for bankruptcy. We know Wiley's merged with academic partnerships. The Pearson OPM business has been sold and is being reconstituted. A lot of churn. So how does that make colos feel for the institutions that work with an OPM? So 31% said we have no plans to change a relationship. We're happy. Things look good from where we sit. But almost the same ratio said we are discussing possible changes, but that could just be a change to the contract, not necessarily tearing up the whole deal. 15% said we're considering exiting the relationship. 10% we want to expand the relationship. So again, that mix of positive and negative sentiment. 9% said we want to renegotiate specific things, but otherwise we want to continue. But 7% said we want to exit the relationship. And then 1% said explicitly move from rev share to fee for service. So my read on all of this is that more stability than change, certainly a watching brief on developments, but underscoring that for many schools, they're happy with the partnership. It's worked well. It's key to their success in the market. They get value. They can't necessarily consider it on their own, which is rather different than the federal point of view, which is worrying about all of these possible unintended consequences. So I think this is good news for the OPM industry. It shows that there's a lot of perceived value rather than this idea that everyone's running to the exits or wants to change everything. So let's go to the last slide. Oh, that was the last slide. Perfect timing. So I'm going to hand over to Janae.
Thank you so much. So yeah, I have the pleasure of talking to you today about AI. One of the most popular topics these days. It seems like you can't go to a conference or have a conversation without AI coming up everywhere. And that's no problem for me. I'm really enjoying it. And a lot of my research over the last year and a half or so at EDUCAUSE has been related to AI. So happy to see that we have been investigating this in Chloe this year. So in the next slide, just a few high-level findings that I want to point out for you. We do see that survey respondents are generally positive about using AI for work that is not student-facing, but then when it comes to getting closer to applications of AI in the classroom or for student instruction, there are more mixed feelings about that. Some respondents reported that at their institution, they're beginning to experiment with AI use for both administrative work and for teaching, but it's not yet widespread. Although I think that the really interesting element of these findings are that we're seeing AI have impacts across the institution, and that's certainly consistent with other research that's been going on over the last year and a half. Where respondents are experimenting with AI for teaching and learning, there are a variety of ways that they're teaching students to use AI or critique AI, and we'll get into some of those details in a couple of slides. And then finally, on this slide, most respondents reported that they're at least working on publishing AI-related policies and guidelines at their institution, though the majority do not have published institution-wide policies yet. These data do point to some positive movement in this area if you compare with other research that's been kind of keeping an eye on AI-related policy development over the last year and a half. Even as recently as the end of 2023, I think you would have seen lower numbers in this area. But definitely a place where institutions as a whole, not just for online learning, are really starting to try to focus some of their energy and develop their capabilities there. So the next slide, we look at respondents' personal overall sentiments about using AI as a tool for online learning. And you can see that the two items that our respondents felt most positive about at the top are not student facing. So they're related to automating administrative tasks. And then the next two items I would characterize as adjacent to student instruction. So academic support for students, designing instructional content. So we're getting closer to instructional use, but not quite directly with students. And then you do see that slight drop in positive sentiments. Then finally, when it comes to using AI directly with students, the proportion of respondents who feel positively about this drops to about half of respondents. And interestingly, here, though, you don't see overwhelming negativity. You see about a quarter of respondents saying that they feel neutral about using AI for teaching. So this is, again, an area that is constantly evolving and developing. I think we have seen a lot of shifting here where initially at the beginning of last year, folks were sort of trying to lock things down and they were very concerned about using AI for instructional purposes. And slowly things are sort of shifting where more people are seeing potential benefits, although still keeping potential harms in mind and being more cautious. Cautiously optimistic is how I would describe things on the whole. So in the next slide, we can see that respondents are experimenting with a variety of uses of AI, as I mentioned. So teaching about AI as a topic, designing courses, requiring students to use AI for coursework, providing students with feedback, designing personalized learning pathways for students. So what's really notable in these data is that for all of these uses of AI, we see that at least some respondents are saying that AI use varies widely by department or program. And this is really consistent with what we see in other research and in conversations I've been having with colleagues at conferences. You just see at institutions these pockets of folks who are very excited and using AI for all the things all the time, and then pockets of folks who are really locking AI use down, not allowing AI use by students, for example, and then everything in between. And that in between, I think, is the most common place. But what we can reasonably expect at pretty much any institution is that you'll see something across that full spectrum of interest. And I think that this has a lot to do with disciplinary norms, for example. I myself come from an undergraduate degree that is chemistry and then a graduate degree that is in education. And so I'm very familiar with how those disciplinary norms play out differently in the classroom. And you can certainly imagine how that impacts things when it comes to using AI in professional contexts or kind of how we see ourselves as academics when we come to work every day, what we think is appropriate or not appropriate for AI use. I also think that it has a little bit to do with just departmental or program level culture. And yes, that's probably tied to those disciplinary norms, but it's also tied to where you are geographically, who your students are, what your students' goals are, what your goals are as faculty and as administrators and so forth. So that take-home message there is just to kind of know that that variability exists. And this is, again, another time that I like to plug the value of collecting data at your own institution to kind of understand where you sit in that spectrum. All right, so going a little deeper on the next slide into how students are encouraged to use AI for online coursework. There are some specific ways here that we asked our respondents about. So again, in alignment with other research, we see teaching students to critique AI generated content tops this list. And for me, this is a really positive sign that we're supporting students to be good digital citizens, good members of the digital workforce. We're really in an age now where students will need to understand how to interpret and judge AI generated content. We're coming up on an election cycle, so that is a great use case to where we want our students to be able to understand what is authentic information and what is AI generated content. And that really is part of a bigger, just sort of digital literacy framework. Understanding that our students are citizens in a digital era, they are workers in a digital era, they're humans in a digital era. And so understanding how to use these tools and at the very least, how to critique, understand what's coming from these tools is really important. I also want to draw your attention to the bottom of this list. So we see that 14% of respondents indicated they are not encouraging students at their institution to use AI for coursework of any kind. And then the last item, 6% of respondents saying that they are actively discouraging students from using AI for coursework. And I kind of mentioned this before. In general, I'd say this is sort of a downward trend over the last year and a half or so of institutions who are discouraging or banning the use of AI for coursework. We can see that in sort of the bigger picture of the body of research that exists about AI for teaching, learning, in higher education. But it's important to keep in mind, of course, and I'm preaching to the choir here, that the online education environment is quite different when it comes to how AI is playing out, particularly as we have concerns about academic misconduct and those types of topics. So it absolutely is its own area that needs to be studied in depth. So it's great that this is included in our survey this year. And I think this is something I'd like to see measured longitudinally and see how things play out. It's also worth noting, and you can see this in table 1 of the full report. If some of you still have that minimized, you could take a look. That larger online enrollment institutions were a bit more likely to be encouraging students to use AI, whereas the lower online enrollment schools were a bit more likely to say that at their institution, students are either not encouraged to use AI for coursework or they were being actively discouraged from using AI for coursework. And we don't have data in this survey to explain why we observe those differences. I do suspect it's some combination of factors, but that is something that might be interesting to explore in future research and also to discuss in your own local context. All right, so on our next slide, just a quick look at how respondents said they're using AI for administrative use. Again, the real take-home message here, the really interesting thing to me, although it's interesting to see these details, so we're kind of experimenting with things like marketing and recruitment and student interventions and student-facing support and so forth. But what's very interesting is more that AI is impacting just about every area of the institution. I don't think there's any research I've seen come out in the last year that has said, oh, here's the one pocket of operations at our institutions that people just aren't even experimenting with AI right now. And so the ubiquity of the technology itself is something of interest where we really do see it both in teaching and learning and in day-to-day operations and administrative tasks and so forth. All right, and the last slide for me, next slide is, as I mentioned earlier, most institutions are at least working on publishing institution-wide AI policies and guidelines, though we do see that only 35% of respondents already have such guidelines published. And that particular data point, that 35% of respondents saying that their institution has institution-wide policies and guidelines published, is part of an upward trend. I mentioned that earlier across higher education and even in industry settings. You're seeing a lot now, if you follow sort of AI topics on LinkedIn, for example. Every other day, I'm seeing another case of a company publishing or talking about their AI guidelines. And then just sort of as a comparison point for how this is playing out in higher education, in EDUCAUSE's AI landscape study that was published in February, less than a quarter of survey respondents said that they had any AI-related acceptable use policy in place. And so to the extent that we can compare those data points, they're different surveys and different respondent pools, but looking sort of at the bigger picture of research that's happening from other associations and other researchers, we're certainly seeing some growth there and more interest in how we can figure out how to put some of these policies in place. And then it's important to emphasize on this slide that at 40%, a plurality of respondents said that their institution is working on policies and guidelines, but don't have any in place yet. So as much as we still have work to do, people are at it and they're trying to figure this out. And it's definitely an active area of interest in higher education in general, and certainly in the online learning space. And this is another thing that we'll keep an eye on longitudinally for sure. So that's all for me about AI. Again, if you have questions, pop them into that Q&A, and I'll pop in there while Bethany is wrapping us up. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Janae. So thank you all so much for attending. We have been answering some questions as we go along, but please do pop any additional questions. We actually have time for questions this time into the Q&A, and we will get to those. Next slide. And I also want to say thank you again to our sponsors. Chloe would not be possible without you. So thank you again to iDesign, our platinum sponsor for a very long time, also new this year, Science Interactive. Our gold sponsor, also a longtime Chloe supporter, Archer Education, and of course our affiliate sponsor, Online Learning Consortium. And for those of you that have not yet downloaded and minimized the report, we have a short link there, or you can use the QR code to download Chloe 9. We did also mention some things that were in some recent Chloe's, Chloe 8 and 7, so you can find all of the past Chloe reports on QM's website as well. You can make a whole weekend of it, do Chloe 1 through 9, have a Chloe party. Next slide, please. And hopefully some of you will join us at QM Connect. So this is our international annual conference. I would love to see some of you in person. We are in Chicago this year. And this is also where that Colo Generosity is going to be seen. So every year at QM Connect, and this is something I love and I'm super proud of being somebody that is at QM, we do something called QM Gives Back. And there's a Scholastic Book Fair there. And that is where the donations go to a local school district in need. So Colos, you will be part of QM Gives Back at QM Connect. I am also doing a Chloe session at QM Connect, really focused on how to use the report for good institutional strategic conversation. So hope you can join us there. Next slide. And speaking of strategy, for those of you maybe that are concentrating on those fall retreats for senior leadership, for administration, maybe you really need somebody to come in from the outside and answer some of those tough questions, help you have some of those conversations with faculty, or more specifically, you really want to have good conversations around institutional strategy and how to really best scale your online initiatives, especially in quality ways. I encourage you to visit our website and check out some of the options that we have for QM Consulting. You can also contact us for free discussion where we could see what your institutional needs are and have a good talk about how we can help you meet them. Next slide, please. So with that, we would love to take any questions or comments. While you type in the chat or type in the Q&A, if you have any additional questions, I'm going to address a question that was asked in our Q&A earlier, and this was also asked last week in our webinar with Eduventures. So I'm thinking that maybe many of you have this question. So it was asked, what do you mean by faculty autonomy, and why is that an issue? Why did it rise up to be one of those top barriers? So specifically, when you're speaking about online learning, you typically have a lot of policies or guidelines that are related to faculty that you don't have for face-to-face teaching. So for example, and past Chloe reports have explored this, There may be requirements or policies for faculty to take professional development in online design, effective online teaching, utilizing technology. There may be institutional resources spent to develop very high quality master courses or foundational courses. Institutions term them different things, but that might be created by a single faculty member or collaboratively by a group. But then the intention is that it's going to be taught by other faculty members. So that's a typical issue around faculty autonomy. You also, at some institutions, and this was explored a little bit in CLOE 7 and a little bit in CLOE 8, there may be institutional standards for online quality, online design, online teaching, especially those that are related to your accrediting bodies and the needs for that you have for online that you may not have for face-to-face. So that typical face-to-face peer review is really not usually akin to the deeper review that you do for online courses. So some institutions have policies that online courses need to be reviewed for standards before they're taught online. So those are some of the faculty autonomy issues that we've seen and that we've heard talked about. Okay, do we have any questions in the chat that any of my co-authors see that we want to answer? And I know, Richard, you had a in-depth question about OPMs that you might want to address to everybody too. I thought that was a very good response.
Yes, so the question was, given 2U's filing for bankruptcy, what does that say about the OPM industry? And my response was, on the one hand, 2U's situation is unique. They'd built up unsustainable levels of debt in order to buy first a couple of companies, Trilogy, and then most expensively edX for $800 million. And the company just wasn't able to generate enough revenue to sustain that debt, higher interest rates, et cetera, as that debt started to mature and roll over. So it was a special case. Most OPMs are not in that situation, but I think it does speak to broader problems around post-pandemic slowdown of online growth. I think growing, yes, but not as fast as it did. Online market maturity, more perhaps programs being launched faster than enrollment is growing, and OPMs just inevitably running into a situation where what was distinctive and impactful 10 years ago is now more routine and ordinary and won't have that same kind of impact. So I think the challenge for OPMs as they are beyond 2U, consolidating, refinancing, merging, is to say, well, what is our value add? Can we push the envelope and do things that are still out of the ordinary at the average school? Equally, can we change our strategy? Can we be more selective about who we work with? Can we try and really scale up enrollment to get those economies of scale, those sustainable margins? Can we innovate on price? Can we invest in non-degree? Can we deepen our partnerships with institutions so it's not just a program or two, but it's an entire online operation? You know, I think OPMs are sort of the victims of their own success. They've proven the online market is real, that it can definitely generate net revenue, but the market's evolved. Others have caught up, and the question is, what next? So I think institutions will continue to need to partner with outside entities as the online market matures, but tomorrow's OPM, whatever it's called, may be a little different than yesterday's OPM.
Yes, thank you so much, Richard. Robin, okay, I already answered your question. Okay, thank you so much. David, great question. Based on what you learned this round, what will you focus on for CLOE 10? Well, that is in part up to you. I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat. Barbara was kind enough to put this in. So we do have a survey link, and you also get this after the webinar. But one of the questions there is, what do you want to hear about for CLOE 10? So, you know, obviously it's the 10th report. It's going to be a big year. We might do some retrospective things. We are also, you know, looking at the past questions. We've started doing some trend questions. So that started in CLOE 7. So those trends might come back around. We did have some trends this year. For example, Eric talked about some things, and this is in the report based on questions that were asked in CLOE 4. So hopefully we're going to get to some new topics, but we want to know what topics are of most interest to you. So please do check out that survey and let us know. Chloe is a year-round project that does overlap. So the team is actually going to start to meet mid-September on Chloe 10, even as we still continue to talk about Chloe 9. I see Eric shaking his head. It never ends, does it, Eric? All right, but thank you again, all of you, so much for attending. I hope you got some valuable information today, got a good overview of some of the key highlights from the report. I do encourage you to download it and at least skim it, maybe even fully read it. And please do take a moment and fill out a survey so we know what is on the topmost of your mind for Chloe 10. Thank you all again. Have a great day.